It turns out that we can create functions in R. We have been using several built-in functions, words, special words in R that perform specific calculations, but we can code, we can write code for functions that we create. This is the general structure of a function. The words, there are some reserved words here, special words in R. The word function is a special word, and the word return is also special. They're reserved. However, the name of the function is a name of our choice. An important thing here is that we declare what the name of the function is. We have an equal sign, we have the reserved word function, and then in parentheses we specified the input arguments. Okay, then we have the braces or the brackets, and inside these braces we have a series of commands that will be executed, and the output of this function will be specified by a value that is inside the command or the special word return. So let's work out an example. Let's say that we want to create a function, code or write a function with this specific name, my square, such that this function produces sums of squares. So the input of the function has two inputs. There are vectors v and w that come in, and the function has an output, and the output of this function is a vector. Okay, so let's take a minute here to read this exercise, and let's switch into RStudio to work this out. Okay, so in this script I have typed a function that basically answers the exercise, it solves the exercise. In one R script, you can type several functions if you wish. Um, Here is the name that we're choosing for this function, my square. Here's the declaration. You can see how those special words in R, the word function and the word return, actually appear with different colors in RStudio. The arguments, the input arguments, are the vectors v and w. Each of them is square, and the sum of the square of this operation, this square operation, is element by element, right? So they are added up together. That's stored in a variable u, and that u is returned. Let's use this new function. And to do that, we could use that in the console. But first, before we do any calculation, we have to execute this so that the R has in memory knows that this is a new function. Okay, so we highlight. I'm going to stretch this. I can stretch this a little bit. Highlight those commands and hit return. Hit run. So now we can call this function. I'm going to say this is my square. Okay, my square. We need to pass two vectors. So how about I pass a vector of zeros? Okay, and I pass a vector of, yeah, again, another vector of zeros. They need to be of the same, they need to have the same number of entries, right? So I'm going to pass two vectors of zeros with 5 entries, and I can call this output. Well, I'm just going to do this. I'm going to hit enter here, and if you square zeros and add, if you square zeros, you still get zeros, and add those two, you still get a vector of zeros. All right, so let's now execute this with a different vector. Say a vector like 1 through 3, and then 4, 5, and 6. Okay, so I'm passing values 1, 2, and 3, and then values 4, 5, and 6. And hit enter, and then what I get in return is a vector which is contains the sum of the squares of these elements. So in that example, the output of the function was one single output, but we can, when we write a function, we can specify that we'd like to return several values. Okay, so um, let's do this exercise. Suppose we want to write a function that has an input that has two input arguments, two vectors, and the output is also two vectors. There are two vectors come into the function, two vectors go out of the function, such that those two vectors contain the square of each entry of the original vectors coming in. Okay, so the function must return two vectors by combining them into a list, and this list contains specific names for the output. So let's see what this looks like as an output. So here on script, we have the commands that define this function called r square. Okay, the input arguments are still two vectors, and we compute the square of each input vector. Here is the square component by component, element by element, the square of v, then the square of w. Okay, and this is the important part. So the word list is also a reserved word, and this is creating a list of things that are separated here by a comma. So there are two things that appear on this list. Here's the first one. The temporary or local variable q is now assigned to a specific name. We're going to call that v dot square. And this other variable, which is a local variable r that was defined over here, is now assigned to a name v dot square. Okay, so let me create a space there for clarity. So the use of this dot is also important, it's something very consistent with Python programming. You can use the dots to create names for your variables. Okay, so let's do similar to what we just did. We highlight, we execute that portion of code. So now this is on memory, and let's use this function. So for example, let's run my square. This is called my square 2. We need to pass vectors, so I can pass here a vector of zeros and a vector of ones. Okay, unlike in the previous example, I'm gonna pass the arguments with two vectors that don't have the same length, right? So let's say I have here a vector with 5 zeros and then a vector with maybe 3 ones. Okay, now in this case, since the output is gonna be we have two input arguments and we have two output vectors. So here it will be convenient to name the output. So I'm going to say here out1, for example. Okay, so I'm going to give the output a name of a variable, and then I will execute this. If I write a column there, then this was the function was called. And if I like to know what store on that variable out1, I type names out1, and this tells me that out1 is a variable that is holding a variable called v square, v dot square, another variable called w dot square. So you may remember how we can access specifically each part here by using the dollar sign. That's what we're going to use now. Out1 dollar sign v dot square, and so that would be giving us the square of the first input argument. And if now we say out1 dollar sign w square, then we will be accessing the square of the second one, right? So The second one was a vector with 3 ones, and so here we can look at each component, each attribute, if you will. And this concludes our briefing on creating new functions.